Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, public safety community and friends. We are here today for another episode of PSN Now News of the Week. I am your host, Jason Karp Esquire, along with my good friend and colleague, Theonius Jasper Kennedy, otherwise known as TJ. TJ, what's going on, my man?
Hey, Jason, how are you?
All right, doing well, doing well. So we've got an action-packed show today. We're going to do things a little bit different. Policing in America. We've got a crisis going on. We've got a lot of activity going on. So we're going to dedicate the show to talking about some of the critical issues going on in policing over the last couple of weeks, and take you through some of our thoughts and the approach and some of the key issues. So let's just dive right into it. I know that, obviously I'm not going to go into the history of how we got here. We're here. We know we're here. We've got issues that the whole world, but certainly the U.S. are dealing with. We know that the International Association of Chiefs of Police has come out and condemned the chokeholds and what happened in a very positive statement. I think that was very commendable and the right thing to do. We've now already seen that the House at the federal level is looking to pass legislation to ban chokeholds, to include a national tracking database of misconduct, eliminate certain no-knock warrants, track and record certain details regarding police shootings. So we're seeing a variety of different things going on. We're going to talk a little bit about this concept of defunding police departments and what that really means. That is obviously a big ticket issue going around right now. And then you've got a bunch of states that are taking action. I don't know that I've ever seen any local governments move as quickly as we're seeing, now, right? With New York taking a number of different steps, including looking to open up personnel and disciplinary files of police so that misconduct can be disclosed. They're looking at banning chokeholds as well. They're looking at requiring disclosure of racial disparities in policing. Confirming that citizens can tape and record police activity. So a lot going on there. Florida is now requiring that officers intervene when they see misconduct. They always had a duty apparently to report misconduct. Now they have a requirement to intervene. Kentucky's mandating a new 8-hour training to address things like racial bias, use of force, civil rights, emotional intelligence, community relationships. And then finally, we got Washington, D.C. right here, just announced this morning, they're looking at new legislation that prohibits hiring officers with histories of misconduct from other departments. And they want to make public names of officers who are using force on citizens. So a lot of different kinds of regulation reforms being talked about. But is this the right approach? And what are the key issues that we in the public safety community and we as citizens need to be considering and thinking about in approaching this in a really, a very responsible way to meet the needs that everybody, I think, ultimately wants to meet, and the goals at the end of the day: keep us safe and remove racial disparity and civil, and inequality completely from how we're approaching policing and public safety. So TJ, let's start with this concept first, just of defunding the police departments. This is a big issue. It's all over social media. It's all over the news. I think there's a lot of misconception about what that is. When folks talk about defunding, what are they talking about?
I'll give you what TJ's opinion is, and I think that there's a lot that this is going to unfold over time on this. But I think often when people are discussing that, they're talking about trying to replace certain functions rather than to defund. And so one of the examples that continues to come up is focusing on bringing in more mental health experts, bringing in more social workers, bringing in others to assist with certain types of calls. I think this would be a welcome assist to law enforcement on many of the interesting and dangerous calls they go on each day where they need that expertise. And so I think bringing that in as part of these departments, whether it's a separate agency, whether it's working hand in glove, a lot of police departments do that today. There are teams that today literally have social workers that ride along with law enforcement that respond to certain types of calls where their help is best needed. And I think that's a great best practice. I know in my town today, they do that. They have, very specific teams that are focused on mental health issues. They have very specific teams focused on homelessness. They have very specific resources that are brought to some of those issues to really resolve the root cause of the call rather than just respond to the call. And I think that's a very critical piece.
We're not talking about disbanding police as we know it, removing the police function. I mean, that's not what defunding is really talking about. It's talking about.
I'm sure there could be some that think that, and they do mean that when they say it. And we should respect that they're driving a dialogue of change.
Mm-hmm.
I think that that's not the right approach. And, personally, I think that we need to look at improving our public safety situation, and public safety is critical to our communities. And I think most people I've spoken to in the past week understand that we do need to have the appropriate funding for all of public safety. And we need to look at that in a holistic approach, while there's still lots of reforms that should and could be occurring.
So you're in Minneapolis, right? Oh, not Minneapolis. You're in Duluth. You're in Minnesota. So talk about what, obviously Minneapolis has made a prominent statement about kind of reinventing police. We know we've seen this at least in some areas like Camden around the country. So what are we talking about there? And what's kind of the history of that been? How does that kind of play into this defunding conversation?
Well, I think a good example is Camden, New Jersey. And this is probably one of the largest cities that has had a similar experience in the past 10 years. It was around 2012 to 2013 that the city of Camden had some major structural issues in their police department. And the local political leadership took a very difficult but strong approach to replace the police department with a different approach. And they ended up with a Camden County Police Department that replaced what was the city department, and some different jurisdictional boundaries, some different approaches, new leadership brought in, an entire new structure, a large number of new officers, and so forth, and an entirely different culture to the police department. The interesting thing about that is we've now had 7 years to go back and look at, did that work? Was there a change? Did it change the culture? And Chief Scott Thompson, who was the leader of that, was also a leader in PERF, the Police Executive Research Forum, very much a think tank on making huge change and positive change for law enforcement in our communities. And the work that he did, and now the new chief that just replaced him, these are important lessons that I think we can apply to other issues. And I don't think this is an issue in every community at the same level. But I think what we saw there, I looked at some stats this morning, about a 42% reduction in violent crime over the past 7 years. I would say that's probably a pretty good statistical outcome for the changes that they've seen. I will say I know from some of the research and people I've talked to, they took a huge gamble on community-oriented policing and really invested very heavily in having officers being in the community, interacting with their citizens, not just on emergency calls and not just on responses, but every single day, and a lot of open community interaction. And that has had a very positive response. And it appears through most of the research I've been able to see that has had a significant impact and a positive approach to changing the way law enforcement is in Camden. I don't think anything's a perfect fix. I don't think any city will tell you that they have the perfect approach. And I think that we need to look at, from a strategic perspective, how can cities and counties and communities approach this issue in a way to look at where are their priorities going forward? Are they different than where they were going into the past? And can they look at a strategic approach, maybe create a new strategic roadmap for law enforcement and public safety in their community that has additional components to it, has a different way to approach how they deal with emergencies in their community?
Yeah, I think what you're saying is spot on, and I think this is an important message. I mean, and for our country, it is not a one-size-fits-all kind of solution. And different departments have different challenges. Some are very good and are very integrated with their communities. Others are more isolated and they take different approaches. And so, one, I think this has to be looked at, very much, yes, holistically in terms of some of the the major issues that we see in policing that may need to change in terms of use of force and other types of global issues. But it's also a very local issue, and needing to look at the communities. And as you said, putting together a strategic roadmap so we're not throwing the baby out with the bathwater, and really understanding what the consequences of each of these decisions are. I mean, I applaud each of the localities. I applaud the federal government. I applaud the police associations, everyone for stepping up and having the conversation, the dialogue, and moving very quickly. I think that's important. I think it's important for our country to see progress. At the same token, as you know, there are unintended consequences often to some of these decisions. And so balancing those out with understanding, as you said, putting together a strategic roadmap of what's broken, how do we fix it? Is this a situation where we, like Camden, we're going to start from scratch, right? We need to rehire the police force. We need to have new screening procedures. Or is it a situation where we can put in some regulatory reforms, tweak some things around the edges, because you've already got a structural agency that's working relatively well, but there are some things that can be improved.
And I think we have to look at this in a very bipartisan way. I think we're seeing bipartisan support for reforms that are coming out both at the city, county, state, and federal level. I think we also need to include law enforcement and public safety leaders along with all community leaders as part of this discussion. I think that I'm a believer that we need law enforcement. We need them appropriately funded. We need them with the appropriate technology and tools. A couple things I've heard a lot about in the last week is, we should probably leverage things like body-worn video and cloud computing for evidence and things of that nature that are going to help this problem that we have and help give us more effective ways to be able to review what's been done and to make improvements and to have that kind of oversight that's going to make for more transparency. I think there's also different tools when it comes to use of force that could be utilized differently. I think training has been an important issue that's discussed. And, often we talk about training for public safety or training for law enforcement specifically, but we have to invest in it. Training means that you need actually more officers on the department so that officers can be in training and be attending training and participating in that. We also have to look at virtual reality training. I mean, are there ways to deliver training via broadband to an officer's smartphone or a tablet or other things, and not all in-person training because that's very expensive and it takes folks off the street? There are different ways to deliver this kind of enhanced training. Do we look at longer training academies, which once again, a lot more investment, a lot more funding actually has to go in to do those things, to have that kind of training. And so to me, I think these are really important things to discuss. In some cases, I think it will cost more, not less.
Yeah, and training is not a one-time thing, right? This is a cultural, ongoing, continuing learning experience that folks need to go through. And I agree with you. I think there needs to be appropriate funding for that. And that might be where, when people talk about defunding, that it's the kind of thing where maybe it's just, we're talking about a reallocation of funds where we need more funding in training or in certain types of areas. And we reduce, purchases of certain, equipment or capital expenses or other things that may not be as effective as we kind of morph through this kind of reform in how, police approach their communities. And, you mentioned community policing earlier, and I'm a huge proponent of that. I know my locality here, they do it. I know in your locality, they do it. And it makes the police much more approachable. They're engaged in the community. And you develop a relationship where they're not just this kind of icon of uniform, but they're people, and we're people. And that's how you break down some of these barriers.
No, I think it's huge. And I think being a part of a community, both living in the community, interacting in the community, being a part of when protests and other things are occurring and encouraging that in a safe and peaceful manner, these are the kinds of things that will make a difference. And also being very approachable. I think it's really important to get outside of the police car and be interacting with folks. And I think that's it's a big going back to our past of how certain things were, but I think it's really important. But I do believe that we need to invest in technology. I do believe that we need to invest in training and that this is ongoing. And I think we do need to invest in having the community a part of these discussions.
So just as we kind of wrap up, I mean, just not to put you too much on the spot, but, given your law enforcement background and all, are there, of the different kinds of initiatives and of course of the issues that you've witnessed in the last couple of weeks, are there specific types of reforms that you think should be addressed? And obviously we mentioned some of these at the top of the show in terms of what's going on, but are there things in your mind that you just see as, yeah, we need to, people really need to think about chokeholds are gone. I mean, there's no reason for it. Or, this kind of bias training or these national databases. Is there anything in particular, from your perspective that you think, at least these departments and these communities should be thinking about implementing that's different than today?
I mean, I think there are a number of the ones you just mentioned that make a lot of sense. I mean, I think there are dangerous arrest control techniques that have honestly been banned by a number of departments for a very long time. And I think that needs to become much more ubiquitous. We just need to be across the board, crystal clear on what that is. And also we need to train officers and give them the appropriate equipment and tools to arrest folks in a safe and secure manner. And we don't always buy those tools. Those tools can be expensive, or those tools cost money, and they can have training that are required. We have to do that. You can't, we have to equip our officers with the right training and the right tools, and put the right policies in place. So it's an and point, it's not an or. There's no option not to do the others, which is to invest in the tools and invest in the training while we make some certain policy changes. So they have to go hand in hand. I think transparency in officers that have disciplinary issues is extremely important, and I am a huge fan of that. Many states have very strict POST standards, which is the Peace Officer Standards and Training Organization, and they have a decertification process. I think it's critical that we leverage those processes for when standards are violated, and that those processes are well used, and there's transparency, publicity. I mean, many states publish that, some states do not. So I think that those are really important things across the community. I think that things that have been optional but fairly popular need to become probably less optional. And a good example is body-worn video. I'm a big proponent of body-worn video. I'm a big proponent of having that to be available not just for everyday prosecutions, but also for improvements and what's happening from a review and oversight perspective. I think that it's an important tool. I think it protects officers when they're doing the right thing, and I think it will weed out issues if they are not. And I think making that part of that transparency is really important. I think the technology, live video components can also make a huge difference. Equipping folks with the right technology is going to help in all of these situations. And so I do believe there are a number of reforms that make sense, but I also think that for communities, they shouldn't just rush into it in a day. I think there's an important roadmap process that folks should look at and make sure that we still have law enforcement, make sure that we still have appropriate public safety measures while we're working through what kinds of modifications, what kinds of training and education need to occur.
Yeah, well, this is certainly only the beginning of this issue, for sure. I know it's come up, over the years, but I think, at this point now, we're really at a cusp and a turning point for seeing some true reform nationwide. And this will not be the last time that we're going to talk about this issue, I think, in more detail. But suffice it to say, this is a complicated matter. Something that we all take extremely seriously, both as citizens as well as folks who are engaged in the public safety community. And I think the key, as you point out, is we need to think through the right types of reforms and the right type of process, bringing all of the stakeholders to the table. This cannot be a partisan thing. This cannot be an isolated, discussion. It has to be an integrated discussion with all the stakeholders within the community. And move forward with those types of reforms that are really going to make a lasting difference. Band-aids are fine short term, but if we really want to see reform, we need to think long and hard about how we approach these things. So terrific discussion. I mean, awesome insights as always, DJ, and given your background in particular. So everyone, we want to thank you for tuning into this episode, and stay vigilant. We will be back next week with more news and information about public safety. And until then, stay safe. We'll see you next time.